back again for the second episode of our audio podcast, and I'm here, and I'm excited to say, with a friend of mine who I met, now, how long ago must it have been? About 4 years ago when I was on the...
It's got to be, yeah.
Yeah, we were originally down at Barista Boho at the time doing my poetry evening, the very first one I ever founded, which at the time was called Bards of Boho, and I remember you come in and you did some local themed poetry for me, and I suppose we've been friends ever since. So for those of you who are tuning in, I'm sat here with a friend of mine called David Scholey, a historian, author, poet, wearer of many hats. For those who don't know David, if you'd like to introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about what you do.
Hi there, Dean. Nice to be here. Yeah, well, I always wanted to write and I always loved local history, but ordinary life got in the way, so I only really began indulging myself on retirement, and I've now written 6 local history books, 5 of them centred around North Shields and Tynemouth. I also do a bit of genealogy and use that to feed into the books that I write, to make them a little bit more personal rather than a load of statistics.
And how did you first get into it, might I ask? When was it? So was it at the point of retirement, or have you always had that love of history and heritage?
Yes, I've always loved history. There were 2 things I was good at school were English language and history. So I always did want to write, and I loved history. And the thing is, with North Shields, it is a fascinating place, and there is so much. Even though there have been lots of books written about North Shields, there's still a lot more to write.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's what I've found.
I think you sort of look at it and you think you've only plumbed the depths of what there is out there in terms of history. There's probably a lot of history there that's just long forgotten or even lost, possibly.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the 800-year birthday of North Shields, of course, this year. But my most recent book, I was curious about why the town had moved from the narrow strip of land at the Fish Quay, going from the Fish Quay to the bottom of Smith's Dock where the Bullring was based, why and when it moved uphill. And I began investigating that, and that was what led me to write my most recent book, John Wright and His Sons, The Men Who Moved North Shields Uphill. And coincidentally, I was in the middle of writing it when on Facebook, on one of the local pages on Facebook, there's a guy from Oxford posted a picture of an image of a silver disc, which his father had found when he was digging his garden not far from Marden Quarry back in 1973.
Wow.
And printed on that disc, on one side, it read North Shields Theatre, 13th of June 1797, Mr. Wright. On the reverse, it was perpetual and general ticket of admission. And, of course, I was writing about John Wright at the time, but the 13th of June 1797 was when the foundation stone for the North Shields Theatre was laid, which is at the junction of Union Street and Howard Street, where the big tree now stands. And John Wright not only was the creator of the modern North Shields Town Centre, but he'd also come to an arrangement to assist in the finance of the building of the theatre, and that's why he was given that ticket. Should I explain, in 1793, Lord Howard, who was the Earl of Carlisle, wanted to sell 50 acres of land just above the Fish Quay, and he wanted £6,000 for it. Now, John Wright was the son of a Morpeth tanner, and he'd become an attorney in Newcastle, and he'd already set out various streets in Newcastle: Savile Row, Savile Way, Savile Close, Queen's Court, Princes Street. Savile Way still exists in Newcastle, the rest have all disappeared over the years, but he'd already set up a number of streets, sold off plots for people to build houses according to his strict specifications, and he'd now turned his attention to North Shields and wanted to do exactly the same there. And John Wright is the guy responsible for streets like Savile Street, Norfolk Street, Howard Street, Bedford Street, Camden Street, Union Street, Newcastle Street, Nile Street, Sydney Street, all the way across to Louvain Way.
Wow.
So he is a very important character, but somebody you never really hear anything about. And his sons too were fascinating guys.
This is it. I mean, I've never personally come across the name before myself, and I've lived here for 34 years now, although I've plumbed into the history of North Shields more recently in my 20s, into my 30s, but I understand there's still quite a lot to learn, and of course you're the man to come to learn the knowledge about that, so I'm quite interested and quite excited to have you today, just basically to pick your brain about all things North Shields, which of course North Shields is the up-and-coming town, I believe, and it seems to be getting its turn in the spotlight, as it were. And there's plenty going on, and there's plenty still to do in the area as well. But with regards to the history and the heritage of the place, could you just tell me a little bit about how it all began with North Shields?
Well, North Shields has always been a town that's been up against it. I mean, it all began back in 1225, although there are some who would say that it might be a year or two out on that. It's the jury is still out debating that, but we're regarding 1225 as being the launch of the origins of North Shields. And what happened was that Prior Germanus decided to set up 7 shields, that's shields without the D, and they were basically very similar to the shepherd's huts that you see out in the countryside. There were places for fishermen to shelter, and he created quays alongside each of the shields for 7 fishermen, basically to have a base from which they could work. And from those 7 shields, a small village grew, and within 30 or 40 years, there were brewers, there were bakers, there were a number of businesses that had set up, and a number of houses that had been created there. Now, within 40 years, this had created a problem for our neighbours, Newcastle upon Tyne, because, of course, any ships delivering or collecting goods from the northeast traditionally travelled along the Tyne, went to Newcastle, paid appropriate taxes on the goods, and then sailed back out the Tyne and back onto the North Sea. Now, the Tyne, even now, it twists and turns to reach Newcastle, but back in those days there were many more twists and turns. It was quite a hazardous journey. So when ships began noticing that there was a small community within a few hundred yards of having left the North Sea, they obviously began thinking, well, why don't we just offload and unload here? And they began doing that. And coal got sent from here. Salt is a forgotten product of North Shields, but in fact it's been a very important product within North Shields for hundreds of years, and it brought in a larger amount per weight than coal did. So there was big business being done, and Newcastle got very upset about that. And there was basically a 600-year war between Newcastle and North Shields. And when I say war, Newcastle did on occasions come and actually set fire to buildings.
Oh, really?
They tried to kidnap the prior.
Oh.
There was quite a lot of violence went on. And of course the prior each time protested about it, either went to court, approached the bishops, even involved the king on many, many occasions. Both Newcastle and North Shields involved the king for him to make a judgment on how things should stand. And this argument lasted for the best part of 600 years between Newcastle and North Shields. So North Shields has survived very, very well, and it's good to see that things are happening again. You know, there's a bit of uncertainty about the Beacon Centre at the present time. Let's hope it is retained in some way that's useful for both business and the people.
Yeah, it got sold, didn't it, relatively recently?
I don't know what the actual position is. You hear all sorts of rumours, whether it's going to be turned into flats or renovated as a shopping centre, but I hope it is created something that is good for business and the people.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, for the high streets in general, you seem more recently to see a bit of a decline. Not just here, but all over the place, because everything seems to have got online. So it would be nice to get the high streets running again. If we could get more local businesses out there in the shops locally. But of course, it all depends on various loads of different factors, like the rents and things of that nature.
The rates. Hopefully the council be helpful to businesses.
Yeah, I think it would be conducive if we all work together towards that aim, essentially.
Absolutely.
But I mean, back then, I think the quote was that North Shields was a town where no town ought to be. I can't quite
certainly
remember
was.
who said it. You might know who.
I don't know exactly who said it. It is something that's quoted many, many times, a town where no town ought to be. There's another beautiful quote about North Shields. If I'm just give it to you, it's a few words, I'll just refer to it.
Sure.
It's described as, this was an 18th century description of North Shields. Over 100 inns and taverns in this area, and they are dirty, seedy drinking dens of base intemperance. For drunkenness and prostitution are commonplace, and many immoral schemes are planned there. It's a beautiful quote.
Very descriptive.
The thing is that back in the 18th century, it was a very difficult place. I mean, there were, as the writer has said, over 100 inns and taverns, but there were also bakeries, there were breweries, there were rope works, there were ship's chandlers, there was all sorts of businesses, but dotted in among the businesses were all these houses. And when you think about the houses, I'm reminded of, you're probably too young to remember this particular sketch. There was a sketch on TV in the days even before Monty Python began, but it included the likes of John Cleese, Graham Chapman, Tim Brooke-Taylor and Marty Feldman, and it was called The Four Yorkshiremen. And the scene was four guys all in posh white suits, sipping the brandies or rums or wines or whatever, reminiscing about their earlier days when they were hard up. One starts, "I was happier then and we had nothing. We used to live in a tiny tumble-down house with great big holes in the roof." And not to be outdone, the next replies, "House? You were lucky to live in a house. We used to live in one room, all 26 of us. No furniture, half the floor was missing, and we all huddled together in one corner for fear of falling." And of course the conversation degenerates beyond that to having lived in a piece of rolled up paper, having to lick the lake clean every morning before you go to 29 hours work. But the reality is that between those first two descriptions, a tiny house with holes in the roof and living many people in a large room with half the floor missing, life for people in North Shields was somewhere between the two at the time. Yes, and there was disease rampant. The people who owned the businesses tended to go and buy or build large houses in nearby Tynemouth. And of course in the mid-1700s, Thomas Dockeray built the first version of Dockeray Square, and they began to use that. But that was quite a small area. So when John Wright in 1793 took over this 50 acres of land from the Earl of Carlisle and began setting up streets for houses to be built, then there was a big take-up of it. The problem is that John Wright died in 1806 when the job still hadn't been completed. He had two sons, John Bowes Wright and William Wright, and they carried on the work, but they did so half-heartedly. John Bowes Wright was very, very, very well educated, initially at Edinburgh University, then he went to Oxford, he was a lawyer, he was qualified at Lincoln's Inn, but he had a taste for travelling, and he travelled across Europe, Asia, North Africa. I mean, most of us have visited the Hancock Museum and we've seen the Egyptian mummy there.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
John Bowes Wright is the bloke who bought that Egyptian mummy at an auction in France and brought it back, handed over initially to the Literary and Philosophical Society, who carried out a very public operation on it, and then they passed over to the Hancock Museum. So really? That's... Again, a link to North Shields. John Bowes Wright, the son of John Wright, is the guy who brought that. William Wright was more into politics. He was a Liberal. He was Sheriff of Newcastle in the very early 1800s. Being Sheriff of Newcastle meant that you had to entertain local people, people from other areas, and you did so at your own expense. So it was a very expensive business for him. He expected to become mayor within about 3 or 4 years. That was the normal standard after he'd been sheriff. But it wasn't until 1820 that he actually became mayor. And of course that meant more expense from his point of view as well. It also demanded a lot of his time. So between John Bowes-Wright travelling and William Wright's political interests, there are a lot of things that didn't happen in North Shields that perhaps should have done.
So things that maybe fell by the wayside due to other commitments.
Absolutely. So the family was sat on this great asset in North Shields, which wasn't really generating any more money because it reached a standstill. There weren't new sites weren't being bought, new houses weren't being built, so they weren't generating an income. And that did catch up with William Wright. In about 1825, his creditors began chasing him. Now, in that era, if your creditors were chasing you, you either went to the debtor's prison or you were declared bankrupt, or both. And for somebody who had been Sheriff of Newcastle, Mayor of Newcastle, that wasn't something he wanted to do. So he shot up to Edinburgh. And the reason he went to Edinburgh is because in Edinburgh there was a way of gaining sanctuary for your debts.
Was this through the church or?
Indirectly. Just getting the right page here. Yeah, 1827 was he fled to Holyrood Abbey in Edinburgh, and that was a sanctuary. No creditor could chase you if you were in Holyrood Abbey, but it wasn't just the Holyrood Abbey area, it was a 3-mile area around that no creditor could touch you. He will have approached the bailey, who then was Peter Halkerson. He'll have had to pay 2 guineas to gain a place in Holyrood Abbey, although Halkerson was known to be a soft touch, and if he was given a good sob story, he'd let you in for a lot less. But it did mean that the creditors couldn't do anything about chasing you, and it gave your family and friends an opportunity to raise the funds to pay the debts off, and your life could return to normal. And that was what William Wright was forced to do. And of course, he and his brother did then get on with developing the rest of North Shields, and Louvain Place hadn't been thought of by John Wright. That was their initiation. The name Nile Street almost came from John Bowes-Wright's visits to Egypt. He'd been to Egypt many occasions, so the inspiration for the name Nile Street comes from that. But, Sydney Street, Newcastle Street, Nile Street, Savile Street, they're all down to the Wright family.
Wow. I wonder if that creditor sanctuary exists now.
Afraid not.
And in curiosity, because this is something I looked into, which very much tallies with what you were talking about with regards to the moving of Shields up the hill, so to speak.
Yeah.
Was it a case, if I've got this correct, where there was a high part of Shields and a low part of Shields, and the low part was those in poverty, and the high part were more of the bourgeois of North Shields? Yes,
I mean, people had to buy the sites, the units from the Wright family, and that, in some cases they rented, more often than not they would try to buy. So obviously not everybody could do it, but it did mean that things could be spread out more, and businesses too followed away from the Fish Quay and began moving up into what we now know as the town centre.
Well, there's an interesting ironic inversion, a gentrification essentially of North Shields, where you find a lot of people who are more affluent are now living on the quayside.
It's been a complete turnaround.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see that, because whereas you used to have, many years ago, those families who were on the breadline, who were in sort of poverty-stricken, a poverty-stricken scenario, living on the bottom, and now
or
you've
on
got,
the stairs,
or on the stairs.
Actually lived on the stairs, not just at the bottom.
And now you've got these sort of £500,000 apartments right there on the riverside.
One thing that really irks me is that just, as you go along the Fish Quay beyond the passenger ferry,
yes,
you come to the fence for where Smith Stock was.
Ah, yes, yeah.
And just beside that there's a car park, there's a block of flats. Now, I cannot understand why the name Bullring hasn't been given to either the flats or the car park.
Oh, so
because
there's no historical
that is where
link?
the Bullring was.
So there's no historical link there at all?
No.
No.
You know, it was a perfect opportunity. The bull ring was basically the centre. Everybody knew the bull ring. Everybody went to the bull ring almost daily. It was the centre of the old North Shields, but there's no memory of it.
Well, I think it's important. Heritage is important, and in order for us to be able to grow as a town, we need to keep to our roots, and we need to understand the history of North Shields and how it was founded, why it was founded, so that when we move forward, we can keep that identity, because it's very important, certainly to you and certainly to me, and I imagine quite a lot of other people in North Shields, certainly older people, but now younger people, I think, are starting to get interested in the history of North Shields, which is great to see.
It is.
But regarding what's going on at the moment, you see there's a lot of regeneration happening, I can see, and there's certainly a lot of fresh money being pumped into the place, which is quite good to see. For a long time, I think we were overlooked,
forgotten town.
and forgotten, and we were just crying out for a bit of regeneration and a little bit of a cash injection, so to speak. But it's nice to see, because you've got the likes of the Fish Quay now, which is thriving. In fact, I think it might be rivaling Tynemouth now in terms of the offerings that it can provide with regards to hospitality,
there,
bars, restaurants, and things
certainly
like that.
Getting there,
and there's a lot going on down there as well. I mean, new bars popping up all the time. I think we've got an Irish bar down there now, which is Penelope O'Shea's. We've got Murphy's. It's a thriving place, and it's a good place to be, because I remember about 20... I mean, I'm 34, so maybe 20 years ago, walking down the Fish Quay, and it was primarily, and it still is obviously a working port, but back then there was very little in the way of offerings for restaurants or for bars. Obviously, you've got the staples, like the old staples, like the Low Lights pub, which has been there since, well, I think it's one of the oldest pubs in Shields, isn't it? As far as I'm aware. But now you've got this great expanse, or this great network of pubs, clubs, restaurants, and things. So it's absolutely fantastic. But back then, I think it was mainly housing, wasn't it? Was it just housing?
It was the housing. Still had various businesses.
There'll still be pubs down there. For example, was it the Chain Locker or the Jungle? I think was it called at the time?
The Jungle, the infamous Jungle. The
infamous Jungle, yeah.
And there was the Portland, the Porter.
Yeah. Well, I read a book. In fact, it ended up being split into 3 books, and it was all of the pubs of North Shields.
Charlie Steele's book?
I think it was, yeah. And to be fair, I think you could fall out of one pub at one point and into the other.
You certainly could, yes.
You know, there must have been over, 300, possibly more.
Well, I mean, the 18th century writer talks about 100.
Yeah,
100 inns, and that'll only have been an estimate.
So what other books have you been writing, or what other books have you got published at the moment?
There's The Walking History of North Shields and Tynemouth, which is a 5-mile circular walk starting just opposite Tynemouth Priory and pointing out things on the way. I mean, although it doesn't actually go into the Priory grounds, it points out that the grave of Alexander Rollo is there. Now, a lot of people have never heard of Alexander Rollo. Alexander Rollo was a Scot who joined the British Army, and he was based at Tynemouth Castle. And he married a North Shields girl, and then he went off to war. And it was during the French campaign. I'll just get the details. Yeah, the Peninsular Wars he was in. But his real claim to fame, if anybody remembers, you'll like this, Dean, a poem, How They Buried Sir John Moore at Corunna. You may have heard that poem.
I think you shared it with me a while ago. Do you have the poem to hand?
I have an extract of it, which is relevant. Alexander Rollo was awarded the Military General Service Medal with 3 class. He was at Relaya, Vimiera and Corunna. But Sir John Moore was the general in charge of the army, and he was killed during a battle. The British were determined that the enemy shouldn't realise that Sir John Moore had actually died. So instead of burying him by day, they buried him at the dead of night. Not a drum was heard, not a funeral note, as his corpse to the rampart we hurried. Not a soldier discharged his farewell shot, over the grave where our hero we buried. We buried him darkly at dead of night, the sods with our bayonets turning, by the struggling moonbeams' misty light, and the lantern dimly burning. The lantern dimly burning was held aloft by Corporal Alexander Rollo, and his gravestone in Tynemouth Priory records that fact.
Wow.
So again, a North Shields character. On his return after the war, Alexander Rollo was the town crier. He was a bit of an amateur tour guide, and he was the sexton at Tynemouth Priory. So he did play a major part in Tynemouth. Even though he was Scottish born, he made Tynemouth his home. He had at least 10 children that we know of, and many of them still live in the area.
Oh, so descendants who are alive to this day?
Yeah, there's still Rollos around.
Wow. There should be maybe an annual get-together of the family members. But also, I've heard that, and I think you'll be the best person to verify this, because I'm a big fan of Laurel and Hardy.
Yeah.
And I believe it was Stan Laurel's dad who had a theatre or two.
Arthur Jefferson.
Was it Arthur Jefferson? Yes.
Arthur Jefferson owned a number of theatres. Actually, Danny Lawrence is really the guy you should be talking to if you want to know more about Stan Laurel and Arthur Jefferson, because it's a hell of a story, not just about Stan Laurel. Arthur Jefferson, Danny Lawrence has written a book about Arthur Jefferson himself, because he was such an important character.
Right.
He was quite a guy. His birth origins, really, you do need to get Danny Lawrence sitting here and have a chat to him. I'll lend you the book about him.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'll be happy to read it. Yeah. Massive fan, and I know obviously we have the statue, which is where Dockery Square used to be. If that's right.
Well, Dockery Square is still there.
It's
now the grassy area is now referred to as Laurel's Park, just
That's
opposite
right,
the
yeah.
Highlights.
Yeah, so that the highlights building, because you've got the highlights and you've got the lowlights building.
Yeah.
And can you just explain what they actually are for anybody who doesn't know?
Right, I don't know if anybody's heard of the Black Middens. Everybody in North Shields and Tynemouth will know the Black Middens.
These are the dangerous rocks in between the piers.
Dangerous
aren't
rocks.
they?
In fact, there's a story about this, you know. It's worth telling you the story behind the Black Middens, the old legend. We all know Neptune is the god of the sea, but the River Tyne had its own god called Kor. And Kor and Neptune got into an argument about whether or not Neptune had the right to enter the river. Neptune insisted he did have. Kor said he didn't, he only had jurisdiction over the sea. And in order to keep Neptune out, Kor went off gathering large black rocks from as far away as Newbiggin, and he spread them across the mouth of the Tyne to prevent Neptune entering. Neptune came along, saw this, and with a sweep of his hand he swept them over to the north bank. And that is allegedly the origin of the Black Middens. Kor, meanwhile, went back home to his bridge further up the river. Kor Bridge.
Ah. And where did you find that? Was it an old historical textbook, or?
It's I think it was Hodgson's. Hodgson was a historian back in the early 19th century, and I read it, I think, first there. But the legend it appears at various times. It's been an ongoing legend.
That's fantastic.
What is interesting is that also in Hodgson's there was an allegation that just beside Corbridge they discovered very large bones, which had to be the bones of a giant, and apparently they were sent off to Keswick Museum. Been in touch with Keswick Museum, they can't find any record of it, which it disappointed me bitterly.
Maybe there's a cover-up.
But getting back to the Black Middens, anybody walking along the side of the river from the Spanish Battery, just below the Priory there, towards North Shields, as they look over, or at low tide especially, they'll see the big black rocks. Now, those black rocks have caused many a disaster for shipping. If you when you're steering a ship in, you need to be on a particular direct line, and that's why the lowlights and the highlights were erected. So on entering the mouth of the Tyne, the navigator needed to have the highlights immediately above the lowlights and follow that line in order to safely enter the river. Many, many ships have gone aground on the Black Middens, and of course in 1864, I think it was, 3 on one day sank.
3 in one day?
3 in one day. And that was what generated the creation of the Tynemouth Volunteer Life Brigade, which we have now, which was the very first volunteer life brigade in the world. And a lot of the people on there, their families have been members of that ever since its creation. There's a lot of surnames that are still the same surnames today.
So this is something that's been passed down generationally?
Yeah, I mean, it's not closed off to other people. Anybody else is welcome to volunteer to join. But there are a significant number of names that, my granddad was in, my great-granddad was in.
And on the point of the river, and obviously the fact that North Shields is a working fisherman port, so to speak, what do you think of the idea that we should move the ferry landing further up the river, closer towards where the hustle and the bustle of the?
Well, it makes sense, I suppose, but it's going to be wider. I don't really see any benefit. I would have thought where it is now is quite satisfactory. It's not too far afield. It's a bit of a hike, I suppose, from where the main fishing area, main pubs and restaurants are. But, as long as there is a continued contact, because North and South Shields have had long links. I mean, I mentioned salt earlier, and salt was something that was... Salt is produced, basically, in very simple terms, from boiling the brine up. But because salt was produced in such large quantities, that for a while North and South Shields was granted the exclusive rights for building any new pans. Nowhere else on the coast, from Berwick as far as Southampton, was allowed to build new salt pans, except for North Shields and South Shields. That was until Scotland joined with England to form Great Britain, and there were so many salt pans in Scotland that could no longer be enforced. But for a long time, North and South Shields had the exclusive right.
Well, the link's strong, and I always look at it like this. I think that if we were to lose that ferry link, what have we got? We've got the metro, which takes twice as bloody long.
Yeah.
Either that, or if somebody wanted to buy a boat and private charter people across the river, but I don't know.
The Tyne tunnel or the pedestrian tunnel.
Or the tunnels, But the ferry, I mean, I've been going back and forward on the ferry for absolutely years, and I remember commuting for a job I had over in Sunderland, and oftentimes when I didn't want to take the bus, I used to get the ferry across in the morning. It was absolutely glorious, and then jumping onto the south side and then just getting the bus from there the rest of the way.
Absolutely, yes.
But absolutely fantastic.
I think we definitely need to keep the ferry, no matter where it is. I can understand the reason for bringing it closer to where the busyness is.
Yes, yeah.
But at the same time, there's a lot of flats at that end, the Bullring area. So there's arguments both ways.
And it's great for tourism as well. I mean, we've got, in the northeast particularly, we're really well connected with regards to travel links. We've got the metro, we've got the ferry, we've got buses. We're quite easy to get to. We've now got the big travel hub in North Shields, quite a controversial one that. Some people like it, some people don't. I'm not going to ask your opinion on that.
I think it's growing on people.
It's quite right. I mean, anything that's going to bring people into the area is a good thing, ultimately, I would say.
Yeah, but we've got to have something to offer people, and that's why I've got concerns about the Beacon Centre.
Yeah, this is the
have
thing.
Something here when they get here.
Yeah, I often think when you go to other seaside towns and you see places where you can go and you can buy even souvenirs, for example, you certainly can do that to a certain extent in Tynemouth and Whitley Bay, but is there a place in North Shields where you can go and get a bucket and spade and a fridge magnet?
I can't think of one these days.
No,
even fishing rods. You can buy fishing rods.
Yeah, that's right.
Fishing, I don't know about bucket and spade, and it's a shame because although there might be a little bit of poetic license in calling it a coastal town, given that we are a few hundred yards away from the technical coastal area, North Shields is the oldest coastal town in North Tyneside. Tynemouth really began up as the priory and a few farms, after North Shields had come into existence. Cullercoats didn't appear until 300 or 400 years ago. Whitley Bay only about 150 years ago. So, North Shields is definitely the oldest coastal town.
And what was the very first book that you wrote?
The first one I wrote was A Walking History of North Shields and Tynemouth. And then I wrote Secret North Shields and Tynemouth. Then The Haswells of North Shields. That lot fascinated me. And there's William Twizzle as well, and his family. But the Haswells I thought were quite an interesting family because I was aware of two units. I mean, Haswells, first of all, the main thing that people think about with the Haswells would be Thomas Haswell, who for 47 years was the headmaster of Tynemouth Jubilee School. But there was another Haswell, who was Francis Robert Newton Haswell, who was an architect. And as an architect, he was responsible for the likes of what we now call Kicky's Cabin. It was the Robinson Memorial Methodist Church, the Tynemouth Union Club, Conservative Union Club, the Garrick's Head, the Cumberland Arms at Tynemouth. He was the architect behind them all, and numerous Methodist churches. The Methodist churches were because his father was John Portis Haswell, who was a Wesleyan Methodist minister and a bit of a troubleshooter. He tended not to have a specific parish. He went off all over the country, finally settling in North Shields, and his son followed him. But Thomas Haswell, his father, I should say that Thomas Haswell's son, George Handel Haswell, wrote a book about his father called The Meister. And that book raised more questions than it answered, in all honesty, because when it described his father, who was George Haswell, it gave a lot of information about George Haswell, a lot of information about George's wife, who was from the Isle of Man. But when it came to describing the birth of George Haswell, it simply said that he was born 1765 in the upper reaches of the river. Now, the upper reaches of the river, at first thought, I was thinking, well, are we talking about the north and the south Tyne, out beyond Hexham?
Yes, yeah.
But the problem with that is that the Meister goes on to record that at a very young age, George ran away from home and went to Sunderland and enlisted himself with a carpenter, but his father quickly found him and brought him home. And I thought, a young age puts the idea of somebody about perhaps 11 or 12, but to go from north or south Tyne and end up in Sunderland, of all places, you can understand many, Hexham, Corbridge, Wylam, Throckley, Newcastle, but going to Sunderland seems a very odd place for him to end up. And I began to look at other possibilities, and one that I looked at was where the river, the Team Valley, basically, where the River Thames runs into the River Tyne, not far from the metro centre. Because if you follow that up, you've got Howellburn and Kyoburn, and when you're in Kyoburn, you're basically in the Tanfield area. And from Tanfield, there were the old wagonways, before steam trains, the old wagonways, which did go to Sunderland, and it would be quite feasible for a young lad either to walk there or jump on the back of one of the coal wagons and get to Sunderland. Yeah. And his father would have realised which way he went, and that explains why you got there. So I had that at the back of my mind at the same time that I was investigating all of these Haswells, George Haswell, Thomas Haswell, Francis Robert Newton Haswell, and his father John Portis Haswell. I looked at John Portis Haswell's birth, and I found he was born in Tanfield. I thought, that's a bit of a coincidence. So I began looking at George Haswell, and was it possible that George Haswell in 1765 could also have been born in Tanfield? And sure enough, going through genealogical records, I found that 3 sons were born in the 1760s to a John Haswell and his wife Sarah Chambers. And there was Ralph, George and Thomas. And George, sure enough, was born 1765. It wasn't anything could say was conclusive. I then found that Sarah, his wife, had died in about 1777, which would have made George about 11 or 12 years old. And when you think back to George running away at a young age, could that be a reaction to having lost his mother? I then discovered that John Haswell didn't marry for some years, but did a little later. He married a woman called Dorothy Robinson. She too was widowed. She had been Dorothy Partis. And among the children she had was a daughter who was named after her, Dorothy Robinson. I then discovered that this Thomas, who was the younger brother of this George that I was looking at, had married Dorothy Robinson. And they'd gone to live in Sunderland. And I knew Dorothy Robinson's first husband was Joseph Robinson. And when I looked at the name of the children, I found the eldest child was Joseph Chambers Haswell. Chambers was the surname of the first wife of John Haswell. And in fact, what I found was that George Haswell was the half-brother of John Partis Haswell. So Thomas the teacher and Francis Robert Newton Haswell were half-cousins, if you like. So I managed to establish a family link there. And again, I mentioned about the coincidence of having come across the coin when I was researching John Wright.
Yes.
Just after I'd finished writing about the Haswells, I was approached by a guy called Paul Robinson from North Seaton, near to Washington. He had in his possession the diary which had belonged to Francis Robert Newton Haswell from the 1860s. So that, he passed it to me, and I've got some friends, Steve and Sandra Barlow, who are now transcribing that because it was written in pencil, tiny writing. Now, Stuart and Sandra have done a lot of research themselves into Francis Robert Newton Haswell. Stuart was an architect himself, so he's got over an interest in him. So they're busy transcribing that at the moment.
Will that be transcribed for publication?
Well, at the very least, yes, I would have thought so, yes. I don't know if Stuart's planning to publish it himself, but I would have thought it would certainly, a transcription of it and the original diary would find a home in the library, in the reference department in the library. But hopefully it would be published as well, if it's of sufficient interest. You know, a lot of it is just, you know, from what we have transcribed, there's a lot of, it's not particularly fascinating. But, you know, there are things, the projects he was going to. He spent some time, Francis Robert Newton Haswell had initially become an architect while he was living in Darlington. He had friends in Darlington. And certainly just after Christmas, he makes a point of going down and spending time with his friend in Darlington. And in fact, he married a girl from Darlington. He married, I think it was the sister of the guy, of his friend. So, you know, he was possibly doing his early courting at that time in the beginning of the diary. So there are interesting things in there. But hopefully that'll be available quite shortly. And the diary will find a home in the library, just as that ticket for the general ticket of admission to the North Shields Theatre. That is now in North Shields Library. It was actually on display a few weeks ago in that theatre exhibition.
Brilliant. What sparked your initial interest in genealogy and the study of family history?
Well, I've got an unusual name, Scholey, and I discovered that Scholey, when you go right back, there's Scholeys all over the world. There's Scholeys in America, Scholeys of Arizona. John Scholey was a mayor in Australia. George Scholey was Lord Mayor of London. And they were scattered all over the world. However, they all come from a very small area of Yorkshire. Every one of them you trace back to this tiny area of Yorkshire.
So it began in Yorkshire, and then obviously everybody sort of travelled and went further afield.
So although I've written 5 local history books, or 6 if you include one about interesting characters of the North East, I've also written a couple of books about the family name, Scholeys of Barnsley and Scholeys of Pontefract. There should be a link between the two. Haven't identified what that is yet.
I suppose it's a detective game, isn't it?
Yeah.
Having to go through and look at historical documents and really get down into the
nitty-gritty. The thing is, new
of it.
records are becoming available all the time, so you never know when something that's been elusive for years might suddenly become available.
And on that point, just in case there's any Scholeys out there, can I just double check the surname spelling?
Scholey.
There you go. There might be somebody out there with the same surname who might just have that little bit of link.
There's a handful
and a bit more
in the
information.
Northeast, but not
yeah.
many.
You might have to come do mine. I've got quite a unique surname. Jolly, G-O-L-L-Y. Yeah. I think it's originally Scandinavian. So I've been told, and I think originally it was spelt with one L, and then for some reason there was a second L added. Yeah. But still. What do you think North Shields might benefit from going forward?
I think, I don't want to say we don't have a theatre because the Exchange put on various things. But at one time, you mentioned Arthur Jefferson, and North Shields was littered with theatres at one time. And I think we do need a decent theatre. I know that there have been people looking into renovating the old Prince's Theatre, but that seems to have reached a dead end.
And where is that? Is that the one that's next to the metro station?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. Did it used to be a bingo hall?
It used to be a theatre originally.
Yeah, so
it became a bingo hall.
So a theatre at a bingo hall, and then hopefully back to theatre.
There's been all sorts of rumours about what's going to happen to it.
Yeah.
It would be nice to see a theatre back, or something that could be part-time theatre, like the Exchange, without wanting to compete against the Exchange. I think there's probably room for more than that. There's amateur dramatic organisations who will be glad of an extra venue that they could use. I mean, we know there's Tyne Theatre there, but North Shields Theatre is just a little bit around the corner. Children's dance places could use it. There's all sorts of places that could use it. So, between the Exchange and another theatre, you could have perhaps musical activities in one, more dramatic type things in another.
Absolutely, yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that, and it's not necessarily like they'd be in competition, because they would just bolster each other.
They could work together, and so make sure that they're not clashing.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say would be your favourite local landmark, out of curiosity? Because I know I've got one, which I often go and visit, and I wonder if it's the same as what you might say.
I think I would have to say the guy who sat on the front of my walking history of North Shields and Tynemouth, the old fisherman looking out to sea. I am fond of him. But, it would be nice to see more images of the old Tynemouth Borough Council emblem, which shows a miner, a ship and a sailor, a shield with 3 crowns on, and Messis Abaltus as the motto.
Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to our audio podcast, and in the meantime, keep talking Tyne. Thank you.